Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It was a regular Friday evening, and my best friend Ronnie had come over to hang out like he usually did. We were in the living room talking and joking around when my stepmom Natasha came downstairs. Natasha had a presence about her, something that made people take notice. I'd never thought much about it before, but recently something had shifted. She dressed the way she carried herself, and it was incredible. She commanded attention, and Ronnie noticed it too. I could tell by the way his eyes followed her whenever she moved around the house. He'd glance at me, but I didn't say anything. It wasn't something we talked about, even though we both felt it that night. Natasha wore a silk robe, and she looked amazing. She came into the room, her robe tied loosely around her waist, revealing just enough to make my heart skip a beat. She handed us the glasses of wine with a smile that made my heart skip a beat. "You boys look like you're having fun," she said. "Mind if I join?" I glanced at Ronnie, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt, but neither of us said no. Sitting on the sofa between us was Natasha. After a few awkward minutes of silence, Natasha leaned in her voice low and said, "I've noticed how you two look at me sometimes." Her eyes flickered between us, and my heart stopped. She crossed her legs and her robe slid up a little, adding to the tension in the room. Ronnie couldn't help but steal glances at her, and I couldn't help but notice how much she seemed to enjoy the attention. We looked at each other anxiously, but nobody of us uttered a word. Then Natasha smiled and murmured, "Don't worry." Her fingers brushed over my calf before traveling to Ronnie's. I've been thinking about it so much that my saliva stopped flowing. I'm not upset at all. I could see the mixture of bewilderment and enthusiasm in Ronnie's eyes as his cheeks became red. Although Natasha was testing the waters with a gentle touch on Ronnie's thigh and a series of little circles traced by her fingers, she added, "I know I'm older, but that doesn't mean I don't still have desires. I've noticed you both have an interest." My heart was racing as I tried to make sense of what was occurring as she grinned at Ronnie and then at me, her hand steadily up Ronnie's calf. Even though she was my stepmom, I couldn't help but be drawn in by her intense gaze and the tingling sensation of her touch. Ronnie squirmed uneasily, but he refrained from removing her hand. As Natasha drew in closer, her breath warm on my ear, her eyelids fluttered with contentment. "We need to quit acting, in my opinion." Listening to my stepmom murmur, "I can feel the tension between us. Why don't we explore it?" was very shocking to me. With her every gesture, grin, and delicate touch, Natasha had been teasing us for weeks, and now, just as I was ready to answer, she was implying something I had never considered, at least not consciously. "Ronnie, what are your thoughts?" Natasha looked across at him, her fingers running up his arm. Ronnie's breath caught in his throat as he gazed at me with a mixture of surprise and want. I was at a loss for words as my pulse raced. My head warned me that something was wrong, but my body was unresponsive. A trembling Ronnie blurted out his words. With a grin on her face, Natasha leaned in closer to him, her lips only inches from his ear. She said, "Relax," and her hand moved up his chest, fingers playfully teasing the edge of his shirt. "Together, as adults, let's just enjoy the moment." Ronnie was conflicted, but the allure was too much, so he swallowed hard and looked between Natasha and me. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. She leaned forward and planted a kiss on his lips. Gently caressing his neck, her lips just brushing across his skin, there was a muted gasp from Ronnie, and I could feel the reaction in his body when she touched him. Neither of us was going to back down. Natasha pulled back slightly, her eyes dark with desire as she looked at me. "What about you?" she asked, her hand now resting on my thigh. "I know you've thought about this too." I didn't answer right away. I was lost in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. But then Natasha leaned in, her lips brushing against mine. "Soft and slow," she said. At first it was a tentative kiss, but when I didn't pull away, Her hand slid up my thigh as her other hand moved to Ronnie's leg again. I kissed her back, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. Her lips were soft and warm, and the way she kissed me made everything else fade away. I was lost in the moment, not thinking about what was right or wrong. All I could focus on was the way Natasha's body pressed against mine and the way her touch sent shivers through me. I felt my heart racing and the heat between us growing as Natasha and Ronnie no longer held back. We moved between us, her hands exploring our bodies, her lips moving from Ronnie to me and back again. Tension in the room had reached its peak, and there was no turning back. Natasha whispered something to Ronnie before turning back to kiss him more confidently, this time with her hand moving up his chest. I watched transfixed as she deepened the kiss, her body pressing closer to his. Natasha's hands were all over Ronnie's back and my chest as she drew us closer, leading us into an unfamiliar, forbidden territory. Her touch was electric, sending waves of pleasure through me, and I could tell Ronnie was feeling the same way from his breathing. For what seemed like hours, we were engulfed in a whirlwind of kisses, touches, and gentle gasps. As Natasha guided us with her hands and lips, she ignited a fire inside me. I was completely unaware that my stepmom, a woman I had known for years, had become my entire world. All I could think about was her. Eventually, I felt Natasha's hand on my chest, gently pushing me back. I collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air, and she climbed on top of me. I felt my heart race as I saw her, her robe parted only so I could see more of her figure. Rapid Natasha moved in for a passionate kiss, her hands running up my arms as she forced herself close to me. Ronnie stood by our side, his eyes filled with longing. Natasha turned to him, her hand reaching out to draw him closer. She kissed him again, her body still pressing against mine. The heat radiating off of her made us all feel completely immersed in the moment. We were tangled up, our breaths mingling, our bodies moving in sync. As Natasha kissed Ronnie, her hands roamed over my chest, tracing patterns that sent shivers down my spine. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to be swept away by the sensation of her touch, her breathing sounds, and the way her body moved against mine. The minutes melted away as our passion intensified. Suddenly, Ronnie joined us, his hands caressing Natasha's figure as he kissed her on the neck and shoulders. Tasha looked at us both, her breath coming in irregular gasps. Her eyes were filled with an unprecedented sense of satisfaction. "You guys did well," she whispered. I was at a loss for words. My head was still spinning from everything that had transpired. I glanced over at Ronnie, who appeared just as bewildered as I was. Seemed like we had crossed an irreversible line, and there was no turning back now. With a knowing grin on her face, Natasha leaned in for a gentle, lingering rendition of "Kiss Me One Last Time." Her voice was filled with happiness as she rose, retied her robe loosely about her waist, and silently left the room. Ronnie and I sat there in stunned silence, still trying to process everything that had just happened. Through a long pause, Ronnie finally spoke, his voice trembling. "What happened?" I shook my head, still in disbelief. We both sat there for a while longer, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. We had both known Natasha was attractive and alluring, but none of us had expected things to escalate the way they had tonight. Now that it was over, I couldn't help but wonder what this meant for us. For Ronnie and me, for Natasha and I, we had crossed into uncharted territory, and I had no idea what the consequences would be. As Ronnie stood up to leave, his expression was a mix of confusion and excitement. "You think this is I?" After a little delay, Ronnie peered over his shoulder to inform me if anything happened. He had been waiting for me to speak, but I remained mute. Eventually, he nodded half-heartedly and made his way to the door. I nodded, still not sure what to say. When the door closed behind him, I was left alone. The weight of everything that had happened was sinking in, and the house was quiet again, almost too quiet. My heart was still pounding, and I could feel the lingering sensation of Natasha's touch, her lips, her warmth. It was surreal. I had just lived through a dream, and it was all too real. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my thoughts racing in circles. What did this mean? How were we supposed to go back to normal after what had just happened? And the bigger question, did I even want to? The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My head was spinning with everything that had gone down the night before. Tasha was still in the house, just upstairs. I was filled with anticipation as I prepared to face her. My mind replayed the moments over and over again, the kisses, the touches, the way her body felt against mine. It all seemed so far away, and yet it was just a few hours ago. I couldn't wait to see her again. I dragged myself out of bed, not sure what to expect as I went downstairs. The smell of coffee hit me, and there she was. Natasha was in the kitchen, dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, completely casual as if nothing had happened. She looked up when she saw me, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Morning," I mumbled, not sure how to act around her now. My mind flashed back to the previous night, but Natasha didn't seem the least bit fazed. She moved around the kitchen, making breakfast as if everything was perfectly fine. She looked up when she saw me, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Morning," she said casually, like it was just another normal day. "Morning," I mumbled, not sure how to act around her now. My mind flashed back to the previous night, but Natasha didn't seem the least bit fazed. She moved around the kitchen making breakfast as if everything was perfectly fine. My voice faltered as I stood there uncomfortably observing her. The stress from last night had finally gotten to me. Natasha, who seemed lost for words, turned to me and sent me a knowing glance. Leaning against the counter, her grin softened and she continued, "You don't need to worry about that." I was ready to blurt out what had occurred when Natasha abruptly stopped me in my tracks. It was unexpected, but it doesn't have to be complicated. We're all adults and we made a choice. We can leave it at that, or her voice trailed off and I noticed her head tilting slightly and our eyes locking. We can explore it a bit more. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what to expect from Natasha. However, she was calm and collected, as if she had thought this through and was giving me an option. I lowered my voice and whispered, "What do you mean?" Now that I wasn't sure what I wanted to hear, Natasha approached with slow, deliberate steps. "If you're interested," she said, "and if Ronnie is interested, we don't have to stop here. There's no need to make things uncomfortable unless you want to," she said, her fingers delicately touching my arm. I gulped hard, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Was this truly an option? I felt the same sensation that had surged through me last night again. I glanced down at my phone and saw a text from Ronnie. "Hey man, what's going on?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, as I wondered if this could go on. "Looks like Ronnie's curious," Natasha remarked, her mouth slightly curved at the corners. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. While staring at the text, my thoughts were all over the place. On one hand, I wanted to tell him that last night was just a one-time thing, that it was all a mistake that we could blame on our intoxication and a moment of weakness. On the other hand, I couldn't help but be swept away by Natasha's touch, kiss, and the way she made me feel. So, without giving it much thought, I responded to Ronnie's text, "You're free later, we should talk." This occurred in the afternoon when Ronnie dropped by, and I could see he was as bewildered as I was. He looked about the house as if waiting for Natasha to show up at any moment, and then he questioned, "What the fuck happened last night?" in a low, uncertain voice. I reclined on the couch, attempting to find the appropriate words to express how I felt. Ronnie sat across from me, his expression betraying his confusion. He shook his head and rubbed the back of his neck, clearly still trying to process what had happened. I was unsure of what to say. Should I bring up our earlier conversation with Natasha, in which she had left the door open for us to continue our relationship? I needed time to think before making a decision. With a gentle, silky voice, Natasha welcomed Ronnie. "Hey, Ronnie! I was hoping we could talk." Ronnie's eyes widened slightly as he glanced at me, but he still smiled and nodded. Unaware of the impending events taking a seat next to me, Natasha leaned in and gently touched my knee before shifting her gaze to Ronnie. "I appreciate that last night was unexpected, but I just wanted to clarify so that nothing becomes awkward between us." Her tone was calm and steady at first, but now I'm worried. If what occurred last night is something you both want, it doesn't need to be an isolated incident. Her candor caught Ronnie off guard, and he blinked in surprise. He glanced across at me, and I could sense both uncertainty and a hint of intrigue. "Want the same emotions that I've been battling all day," Natasha went on, her voice gentle but determined. There was a long pause as Ronnie and I exchanged glances, trying to process what Natasha was suggesting. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made my pulse race and my mind spin finale. "I'm not asking for anything serious. This doesn't need to be complicated. I'm offering you both something different, something exciting, but only if you're both comfortable with it." When asked what would happen if we answered yes, Ronnie's voice almost rose above a whisper. Natasha's grin grew slightly, and she explained that there would be no ties attached, just the two of us. As the three of us sat there, the gravity of Natasha's remarks began to set in. She was being serious, and the decision now rested with us. Once again, Ronnie locked eyes with me, his gaze probing for a confirmation of my thoughts. It was at that very moment that I realized I didn't want to answer no. The fearful, hesitant side of me was losing ground to the eager, determined side. Despite the intense adrenaline surge, I maintained a calm voice and silently nodded, "I'm in." "Yeah," Ronnie responded with a strong voice after he paused for a second. It is my, with a pleased grin on her face and a twinkle in her eye, Natasha rose to her feet and approached Ronnie, reaching out to touch his arm. "Let's not waste any more time," she whispered, her lips gently pressing against his. Through a brief moment of leaning in, she pulled away and she turned to me. As Natasha moved in for another kiss, the same gentle, lingering kiss that had sent shivers down my spine, her eyes were filled with promise. She smiled at us both and gently whispered, "Let's continue what we started." Our bodies were crushed together as we explored this new and forbidden area, and the rest of the day was a frenzy of sensations, kisses, and heat. By her gentle touch, Natasha ignited a fire within me that I had never known existed. Whenever I felt like we were crossing a line, she would gently guide us back, comforting us with a kiss, a whisper, or a touch. Ronnie and I were swept along with Natasha, our bodies moving in perfect harmony. The tension between us grew until it burst into an explosion of unmistakable desire. None of us dared to question or question again. We were all completely absorbed in the moment.